Hi guys and welcome back, this is SK again. Just one thing before we get started with today's battle. For those who haven't had a chance to read my profile on YouTube here, I'm going to be fully concentrating on monotype battles now and in the future. So if you're really into monotype and you want to have a look at some decent battles, just subscribe to my channel. I'll be trying to post one every week, given that I'm not too busy at university. But let's get on to today's battle. Today's battle is against a guy called Soy, who I met in the Cerebral Wi-Fi chat, and he has a very balanced team, given the difficult type he has chosen. So let's get underway. My opponent leads off with Roserade, and funnily enough, so do I. This could mean one of two things for my opponent. He's either running a grass monotype team, or of course a poison monotype team. I myself are going for a poison monotype team. People might be thinking this is a bit imbalanced, given the obvious advantages poison has over grass, but I assure you this is a very even battle, with lots of good predictions on both sides. In the meantime, I tried to set up my toxic spikes. Given that he has Roserade on the field, it can easily soak up my toxic spikes. It seems to be rather useless at this point. I go for the sleep pattern again to try and scout out this team, and attempt again to set up my toxic spikes. My opponent opts to send in a Breloom, which thanks to my toxic spikes gets poisoned, which is not very good for me. Knowing that Breloom is very weak special defense wise, I go for a Leaf Storm, which after the Life Orb is going to do considerable damage to anything. And Breloom easily goes down with that attack. My opponent then switches back into Roserade, possibly trying to get me to sleep, but also absorbing those toxic spikes. Given that my sleep pattern misses, he does exactly that. My opponent then opts to switch into a Shiftry, while I opt to switch into a Gengar. Unsure of what's to come, I go for Protect. Unfortunately for me, not paying attention, I missed that sunny day there, and kept my Gengar in very foolishly, so my Gengar gets completely wasted. But given the lack of rapid spinners in the grass metagame, I doubt that there is any risk of me losing any entry hazards, bar for poison type Roserade. I then sent in Tentacle to scare away this Shiftry. I then go for a Sludge Bomb, which is going to do decent damage to anything that comes in, given that it is a grass monotype team. With the sunlight bearing down, I send in Nidoqueen to try and set up more entry hazards and roar around his team. He sends in the Shaman. Fearing the Seed Flare, I don't want to lose my Nidoqueen just yet, so I send in the Roserade, which luckily for me dodges the Leech Seed. I then go for Sleep Powder to try and set up my toxic spikes, and then try and scout out the rest of his team. With the sunlight about to run out, he sends in a Sceptile, while I opt to set up more toxic spikes. He goes for a Dragon Pulse there. Unluckily for me, he scores a critical hit, thus defeating my Roserade. I send in the Tentacruel to again try and scare off his strong special attackers. Seeing the switch there, I predicted it could be Specs, given that a strong leaf attack from a Sceptile could do decent damage even to Tentacruel. I then opt for Sludge Bomb, which does considerable damage to his Shaman, easily to hit KOing it if given the opportunity. He then opts to switch again. I going for Sludge Bomb again, hit this Roserade for again very decent damage, although unfortunately for me he then again softs up my toxic spike. I go for the second Sludge Bomb, then KO that Roserade quite easily. He then sets in the Sceptile. I then Protect to see what attack he chooses. Seeing the Leaf Storm, I know Tentacle is easily going to be KO'd by that, so I opt to send in my Venusaur, which has 4 times resistance to grass, and will take the Leaf Storm quite easily. Even though my opponent scores another critical hit, it does very minimal damage, given Venusaur's 4 times resistance to grass. My opponent then opts to switch in Shaman. I also opt to switch into Drapion, given that I now have free reign to set up Toxic Spikes, given that his Rose Raid is now KO'd. My opponent then opts to switch back into Cradilly, and I get my second layer of Toxic Spikes up. Completely forgetting about Cradilly's ability, I go for Roar, which is obviously ineffective. Given Cradilly's bulk, I know that my physical attacks will do very little to it, so I opt to Protect Stall and rack up the poison damage. Drapion then goes in the offensive, trying to bring this Cradilly down, but as I predicted, it does very minimal damage. Drapion finally goes for one attack, and Cradilly goes down quite easily. He then opts to send in the Sceptile again, and getting toxic poison out there. I go for Protect to scout which attack he chooses. Seeing the Dragon Pulse, I know that my Tentacle hopefully would not take that very helpfully, and Drapion being quite weak to special attacks, I have to switch back into the Venusaur to wall his offensive push. Given that I lack no viable attack move to hit this Sceptile with, I opt for Protect to rack up the poison damage. Because I have no viable attack, I opt for Roar to spread the poison damage to the rest of his team. Out comes his Shiftry, which gets Toxic Poison, and I recover a bit more HP with my Black Sludge. My opponent goes for Nasty Plot, and given that Shiftry has rather poor special defenses, I opt for Energy Ball to try and weaken it a bit. Convinced my opponent is going to go on the attack here, given that the poison damage is racking up, I opt for Protect. But unfortunately for me, he sets up the Sunny Day, which opens up the possibility for my opponent to do a late game sweep. I choose to relinquish my Venusaur here, taking a Nasty Plotted Stab Dark Pulse, which will easily KO it. But given that the toxic damage is reaching its peak, Shiftry easily goes down. I then have to send in Nidoqueen on Venusaur, and he sends in his Sceptile. With nowhere to run, I brace myself for a Stab Leaf Storm. And Nidoqueen survives with a miraculous 3 HP. I then go for the Fire Blast, while during the sunlight is going to do incredible damage. A rather redundant critical hit there. With the prospect of just getting stalled by the rest of my team, my opponent opts to flee, ending the game in a comfortable 3 versus 1. So there we have it, another monotype battle. Good game, Soy, and for those who want to keep track of my monotype battles, comment, rate, subscribe. and I hope to see you next time. This is SK.